We've been very fortunate through Mark's hard work to have great speakers this year. We started off with Joe Carrillos, and we had the freeholders the next month, and we had the sheriff. And now to put the cherry on top of the sundae, I give you our Congressman, Christopher.
Thank you for inviting me here to be here, Mary Jo. And Mike Berman, for years, especially when I was chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee, was not only a source of inspiration, but we worked so closely together on one veterans issue after another. So I just want to publicly acknowledge that. We worked together, and he was just tenacious in making sure, and his prayer just a few moments ago about those who suffer the consequences of battle. And we know, with approximately 50,000 wounded from Iraq and Afghanistan and over 6,000 combined killed in action, the enormous consequences of any war, including those ones obviously still going on. Thank you, Mike, for your work on that. Steve, that was, I should quit while I'm ahead. Thank you so much for that, for the kind comments and all the kind comments, frankly. I'm not going to stay in bed 1A ever. Mayor, that was a good warning about what hospital was that? Dick Work heard this the other day, so I will be relatively brief. Or when I see the timeout sign, Greg, I will know that you have to pull the plug. But I have learned a lesson, and I have learned a very important lesson a few months ago when I spoke at a Lyme disease, and I said this to Dick Works when we were in Manchester the other day. But I work on Lyme. I've been working on it since 1992. When at a town meeting, a woman from Jackson, who runs the Lyme Disease Association of America, Pat Smith, asked me to get involved. I got involved. I've been working ever since, and I have a major bill that I think will become law very shortly. But that said, they said you have an hour and about 5 or 15 minutes, I forget which, to give a keynote. So I'm one of those who love to write. I write keynotes all the time. I like to write op-eds. I do like to write. So I gave an hour and 15 minutes. And I got into the weeds about the disease, its devastating impacts, and at the end, this little girl, because there are a lot of families and they're out in the audience, came up and I'm standing by the podium, a few people came up, and she goes, "Mister, your speech was long and boring." And she spun around and walked away. A few minutes later, her father came up and said, "I saw you talking to my little daughter, Melissa. I just want you to know she's just repeats whatever she hears." So ever since then, I got to keep this thing short. I am running, as Steve said a few moments ago, for my 17th term. I have never been more enthusiastic, committed, and aggressive, in a benign way, I hope, but aggressive nevertheless, in pushing human rights, democracy, rule of law, a thriving economy, care for our veterans and for his widow and orphan, his or her, because there are so many fatalities now occurring among our females in the military. But just to take these issues and run with them every day. My staff and I, and Jeff, are you here? I can't even see without my glasses. Jeff's our district director and does a great job domestically in the district, working on issues, and so I thank him for that. And I just want to say that when somebody walks into our office, we don't care if you're Democrat or Republican, Independent, didn't vote, no matter, and they say, "I have a problem." We roll up our sleeves and we work night and day to try to resolve it. We've had over 80,000 individual casework problems, and sometimes they occur like with the David Goldman case. My wife and I were watching Dateline, and we're sitting there watching. At the end of this Dateline presentation, David, after 4 years of frustrating, never even getting to see his abducted son, says, "If there's anybody out there, will you please help?" Please. It was just my wife turns to me and goes, "Call him. What are you going to do?" And I'm there, but he's in Rush Holtz District. We do have a gentleman's agreement that people usually, stay within their parameters on a lot of casework. So she says, "You're going to let that stop you? This guy is in dire straits. What is Holt doing?" So to make a long story short, I called up Mary Noonan, my chief of staff, that Friday night and said, "See if we can meet with David and his attorney, or anyone involved with his case, next week." Monday, I had a meeting in the Whiting office. We spent about 2 hours, almost 2.5 hours, going over the case, and I said, David, if I could be of help, I will go to Brazil and I'll spend time with you. We'll meet with government officials, because right now it is David versus Goliath. You're not just fighting against an abductor. You are fighting a legal team in Rio de Janeiro that used to be the people that our embassy went to get help on abducted children. I mean, talk about a perverse 180. Now the people who know how the game is played are working to sanctify an abduction. So I met with him on Monday, and by that Friday I was in Brazil, spent the better part of a week. We met with members of the Supreme Court in Brasilia. I went to his hearing when he tried to get access to his child, and then went with a court-ordered, and it was one of many, but this one got honored, drove with him when he saw his son for the first time, and it was an unbelievable transformational experience for me to watch him with his son. Haven't seen him in 5 years, and it was as if they had never been separated. The hugs, and I took pictures. Those pictures were used later on in court cases, the court case. To make a long story short, he got his son back. But one of the greatest lessons learned was just how indifferent, probably because of the culture, because there are a lot of good people in the State Department, but just how indifferent the administration was in taking up the cause of an abducted child and his father. And there are females, moms, who have had the same thing happen to them, and I've had them in hearings since. And they didn't get this, and we just monitor the situation. U.S. Department of State monitors it. Fast forward to Jacob Ostreicher, the same thing. Now, more than 500 days in Palmacero prison, a hellhole in Santa Cruz, Bolivia. And here's this man who has been accused of nothing, guilt by some association that is a stretch, who our department, State Department, monitors. Where's the advocacy? I've had 2 hearings. We've had Jacob's daughter, right from here, come and testify, who was outstanding, his wife, his legal team. We've asked the embassy, we've asked Hillary Clinton, we've asked President Obama to pick up the phone and talk to Evo Morales and say, there's an American here. Matter of fact, it's prescribed by our national statutes that the president needs to fight for. We've quoted the statute to the president of the United States. If you asked Obama tomorrow, I don't think he'd have a clue what you're talking about. Same thing happened with David Goldman. We tried repeatedly to get a meeting so that he would talk to, in that case, it was President Lula of Brazil, and nothing, zero, zilch, indifference. A mention to a foreign minister, a mention, but no real heft behind that effort to get Sean Goldman back, and we're seeing likewise deja vu, and it happens all the time. There's 2,500 kids, American kids, who have been abducted. I went to Japan on behalf of a veteran of Iraq from North Jersey, who married a Japanese national. Unfortunately, the marriage went awry. That happens in real life. The judge said, no passports, pulled the passports, and lo and behold, since she worked for the consulate office in New York, she went to Chicago, got 2 replicas made, jetted off to Japan, and now going past 3 years, he has not seen his kids. So I went over there, I pressed it, and there has been, even our Assistant Secretary for Asian Affairs testified at one of my hearings and actually apologized to the families, the left-behind parents, and yet we haven't seen a change in policy. We haven't seen what I believe ought to be. I have a bill, called the Sean and David Goldman International Child Abduction Prevention and Return Act, which would finally do what I did on trafficking. In 2000, I wrote a law called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It was opposed by the Clinton administration in most of its aspects. They liked a few aspects, but most of it they're against, which combats modern-day slavery, sex and labor trafficking. That legislation now is, I think, the quintessential example of when you want to push human rights. You say there's a penalty phase if a country is lax, indifferent, or enabling of the human rights abusers. Every country in the world now has human rights laws on trafficking that look remarkably like the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Matter of fact, I gave it to members of the Duma in Russia, friends of mine who work in the Russia. It was a woman named Nizolina, who was a deputy at the time, translated in Russian. She got much of it passed in the Russian Duma. We need to work in a global way to combat modern-day slavery, because it is one of the cruelest exploitations on the face of the earth. But Clinton opposed it. He ended up signing it at the end of the day, and I'm always grateful for that. But now we're seeing that same kind of stop sign going up on abduction cases, on Jacob's Law, which is what we've named a law which borrows heavily from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act to say if there's an American in prison anywhere in the world, we're your advocate. Now, if you've committed crimes, you got to pay the time. But if you are innocent and you're in a dictatorship like Bolivia or China or Venezuela or many of the countries around the world, we're going to be your advocate. We're not going to go in and say, how's the food? Are you getting your medicines? Which is basically what we've done with Jacob. And Jacob, I talked to him last week. I talk to him often. He does have a cell phone, and thankfully the embassy has tried to make sure that he has an ability to communicate. But, you know, he is very disheartened about the state of affairs of what his government, our government, has not done for him. So I'm going to push the Jacob's Law until that is enacted. And I'm already talking to the Romney people. God willing, he wins this election. They understand that they need to be advocates for Americans, and they're not. And, you know, he was a successful businessman. I said to the embassy, why aren't you warning other business persons in Bolivia, American, that this too could happen to you? I know several members of the parliament, the Congress in Bolivia, who are in the opposition. One of them is named Pinto, and there are many others. They have been held. They have been threatened with lawsuits just like Jacob, and one of them went to the Brazilian embassy seeking asylum because he had so many threats against him. That's how they do business. I met with the Minister of Governments, who is the Minister of Interior, the prosecutors. These are the people that are doing it to Jacob. And they said, he doesn't want, bail. I said, are you kidding? I was at the bail hearing. And you intimidated the judge and said, if you grant him bail, relative freedom, out of that hellhole called Palmacera prison, we will bring charges against you, Judge. So they used that intimidation. It is prosecutors gone wild, rogue prosecutors. And I asked the minister, what do you do when you have rogue prosecutors? And it was like a question he had never even been asked, thought about, and certainly did not want to answer. So we're pushing hard on that, but it's systemic. It's indicative of a larger problem within state. And I hope if I get a chance to be chairman, or if I don't, I will be pushing that issue aggressively every day. On the economy, we are in dire straits. We all know it with the debt crisis. And the debt crisis has been so exacerbated by President Obama and his unbelievably reckless spending. $16 trillion. $1 trillion is 1,000 billion. These are numbers that are incomprehensible, and we're spending $4 billion more in debt every single day. And over 40 cents on every dollar that we spend now is borrowed. Either through Federal Reserve buying things that, out of a fund, and where do they get the money, printing dollars, or selling our debt overseas to places like China. So it is totally unsustainable. And it puts my grandchildren, we have 2 of them now, and we put one in our little Grace, who just saw the picture today and told my wife, her grandmother, and her mother, she was all smiling when she saw the picture. But we put her at risk, we put our kids at risk, and even Ahmadinejad said this week, look at the United States and their debt problem. How long can they last? And unfortunately, for a man who is anti-Semitic and a monster like Ahmadinejad, there's an element of truth in what he's saying about our sustainability economically. And if the economics aren't working, they all know our ability to project power and to be, truly a force for the world becomes at risk. And so we've got to be concerned about it. I think Romney gets it. Governor Romney, he knows how to run things. He'll be tough but fair. President Obama has been, how many checks do I write? And of course, so much of it is geared to helping Democrats and Democrat districts and Democrat states. Obamacare, and I'll just do a couple more, otherwise I'll have that little, there's no little girl here that can come up with it. Obamacare, as the Wall Street Journal so aptly put it, is the worst piece of legislation ever. Our hospitals, and I mentioned this earlier, when I was in Bayhead. No, I wasn't in Bayhead. Where was I?
Bayhead.
Bayhead, I was in Bayhead. I've been in 3 other places since. When I was in Bayhead, the hospitals in New Jersey, $4.2 billion over 10 years. We've heard in all 3 debates, $716 billion. When you break that out, $405 billion of it comes out of America's hospitals. Hospice gets hit. Home health care gets hit big time. And home health care is a great way of keeping people out of nursing homes and trying to promote a situation where you're healthier and you're at home, out of a hospital. Saves money. It's also, I'll finish. Many of our hospitals are going to take it right on the chin, losing tens of millions, in some cases like Jersey Shore, 125 million plus over 10 years. They can't sustain it. They've been all in crisis and talking about life support and bed 1A. They've been in bed 1A for years, merging, acquisitions, doing all kinds of creative things, become more effective. They've cut the fat out. It's all down the bone and sinew now. How much further can they go? Now they're going to take another hit. It's very troubling. And if remember President Obama said, if you like your health care the way it is, you can keep it? Nothing could be farther from the truth from that distortion. We're already seeing 30% plus businesses saying that they're going to dump their employees into the exchanges. Small businesses, the powerhouse of creating new jobs, are holding up. How can I hire somebody new? What does this all mean to me? So it's had a chilling effect on new jobs. And some of the industries are already saying that we'll just have people work less than 30 hours. So I'm not liable for the $3,000 plus fine that Obamacare imposes on me. Everything's done with fines. You look at Obamacare, it's filled with punitive sanctions against employees and employers if you don't do as President Barack Obama orders you. This is America. We don't do those kind of things. Finally, in terms of foreign policy, and that will be the debate on Monday, and I hope Mitt Romney really goes for it and points out the weaknesses of this administration, which are legion. I remember when the so-called Arab Spring was breaking forth, and this administration was waxing euphoric about what was happening in Egypt. It was like, are you kidding? The Muslim Brotherhood is in ascendancy and you're happy about it? President Mubarak, really it turns out he took money, and that's awful. We could have been talking to him about that. Every time I met with him, and the first time was back in 1996 in Cairo, and every year when he would come into Washington, we'd have a meeting of foreign affairs members, and I pressed him on two major issues, and I wasn't the only one, but I always pressed him. The anti-Semitic nature of his state-run media, which unfortunately had much anti-Semitism in it, but he did honor the peace treaty with Egypt. And secondly, the cruelty of some that didn't go punished towards the Coptic Christians, burning down churches. But it was the Pope of the Copts, supported Mubarak because they had a two-way exchange, and things would happen to ameliorate problems when they arose. But it wasn't perfect. In comes the Muslim Brotherhood. Not only is a very, very strong Sharia law and constitution and policies being promulgated, but you now have a situation which they missed by a mile of the peace treaty being at risk. Yes, our foreign aid is linked to that. If they break the peace treaty with Egypt, it's severed. $1.3 billion goes out the window. But to show you their lack of concern for religious freedom, 3 of us in the House insisted, maybe it was a few more, but we insisted, Frank Wolf and I and Trent Franks, that religious freedom be put in as conditionality to our foreign aid for the fiscal year 2013. Our ambassador and the State Department, that's Obama, objected to it and fought us on it. We put it in anyway. In comes the president, they waived it, and even though things have gotten demonstrably worse and cops have been killed in huge numbers, we don't lift a finger. I had 3 hearings on Egypt this year that I chaired. 2 of them focused on an issue that I can't get this administration to focus on. And that is that they are abducting little Coptic Christian girls who are teenagers and forcing them into Islamic marriages by the thousands. We had a woman who did the actual human rights reporting on this come and testify at my hearing. It's on C-SPAN, you can watch it. And she said, it's not an allegation. I've done this myself. She's been a human rights leader for years. And what they do, they take these little girls and very often she just disappears. Next thing you know, she's in a marriage, and if she leaves, she's, apostasy. She can be killed. It's a terrible, and they call it Islamicizing the womb, because any children she bears thereafter will not be Coptic Christians, they will be Muslims. If somebody wants to be any faith they want, that's their business, that's religious freedom. But to say that you force it and coerce it is... So I had 2 hearings. I had the Assistant Secretary of Human Rights, Democracy and Labor, Michael Posner, testify at one of them. I gave him, I physically put it in his hand and said, please, Michael, he's a good guy. You got to investigate this. Frank Wolf took everything from my hearing and put it in our ambassador to Cairo, to Egypt, put it in her hands. 1 year later, the ambassador is on a telephone hookup with members of Foreign Affairs. I said, Madam Ambassador, have you deployed Foreign Service officers to investigate the forced marriages and the trafficking of Coptic girls into these? She goes, well, I haven't gotten around to it yet. I couldn't believe it, and I let her know. I couldn't believe how what are you doing? This is a major human rights issue, and it's gone unattended. But I say this as one example that is symbolic and emblematic of what this administration has done all along. Human rights are not even in the back door. They're out the door. They're out in the parking lot somewhere. They have had no human rights policy. And as a result, the dictatorships around the world have taken their cue from that. And it comports with what Bill Clinton did during his 8 years. Human rights were non-existent. He would talk a little mouthing about it, but when it came down to real policies, they were slim and none, mostly none. And name the country. I can give you an example of every country in the world, including Cuba, all of the Middle Eastern countries, African countries where we've been asleep or AWOL by design or because incompetence. I think it's more by design. I mentioned this earlier when I was in Bayhead. China. I've had 41 hearings on China. China poses, like radical Islam, the greatest threat to the world, in my opinion. Yes, we have, and of course, Iran, and that's the Middle East, or the region, is the greatest threat, I believe, right now. But we have enabled that dictatorship by our silence and indifference on human rights these entire 4 years. Religious freedom, the issue of coercive population control. Barack Obama reversed George Bush and reversed going back all the way to Ronald Reagan. We are giving money to organizations that enable, support, and cheerlead for the one-child per couple policy in China, which has led to the loss of 100 million girls who are missing, the daughters that are missing, and it's called the UN Population Fund. They are the ones who started it, co-started it in 1979, and have supported and co-managed it every year thereafter in China. On torture, on labor rights, name the human rights issue. This administration has been asleep. I'm going to be on Fox News at what time, Jeff? 12:40. 12:40, I don't know how long it is, not that long, before the debate, but this is Sunday, to talk about China. So, I'm going to try to get some of these things out, because we deal so superficially with China. All this, and I mentioned this again at Bankhead earlier, but there's so many other examples. Every time Barack Obama goes there, or Hillary Clinton goes over there, human rights are an obligatory mention. So they can say, I raised human rights. But they don't. There's nothing behind it. It's usually on page 5 of their talking points. And we've seen it over and over again. And again, what is China doing? They're in an expansionist mode, unlike I've ever seen. Japan is frightened about their expansionists and their settling of scores from World War II. We know that Taiwan is always in the crosshairs, but so are all the other ASEAN countries and the others in the region. And of course, that's us too. Because, we could easily be drawn into a war by miscalculation because of all of the growing hostilities. A Blue Water Navy and all of the other transfers of technology that have enabled them to create an unbelievably strong military industrial complex, courtesy of the United States of America. And it's gotten only worse in these last years. So China remains a huge problem, and this administration has been AWOL in combating it. I'm not saying you go in there belligerent. I've met with Li Peng, I've met with top leaders. I can't even get a visa, as I said earlier, to go because I've been barred from going to China by the Chinese government. But I probably said enough on China, but it is really a huge miscalculation, threat assessment that has not been done. And we will rue the day unless we have someone who really understands. We need to get that country to matriculate, even if it's incrementally, towards a democracy. Because this dictatorship is absolutely out of control. so that's a couple of things, and again, I'll have that little girl coming up real soon. If you have any questions, we'd love to answer them, or try to. But Iran is another case, Syria is another case. You go back, Hillary Clinton said, and quoting some members of Congress, that Assad might be, a more reasonable person to deal with. Wow, what a miscalculation of a dictatorship that is. Just like Egypt, just like everything else that has been going on in the Middle East. And then the faux pas of faux pas, what were they thinking when our ambassador and 3 other individuals were killed in Libya? To spin a yarn as if everything has gotten better because they killed Osama bin Laden. I wish they would have captured him. Maybe that couldn't have been done. But certainly killing him was the prudent thing to do, if that was the right thing to do at that time. But don't politicize it. If George Bush were to be saying this at the convention, he would be roundly criticized by the liberal media, and not a word that I've heard. It's just a little bit on the bizarre side. But to say that about Assad, they keep missing all of these opportunities to, as best we can, manage very difficult crises. They make the wrong decisions. And I asked, I can't. It was a closed hearing. I can't talk about it. But it's all going to come out. It's all going to come out after the elections. And finally, when they came back on Darrell Issa, on cutting embassy security accounts. Yes, there was an amendment. I think they're talking about the amendment by Steve Boyer from Indiana. I voted no on it. But frankly, when an ambassador or any official says, I think I need more security, and you're in a place called Libya, you honor that request and you do so promptly, or he doesn't go to the consulate. Embassy, security calls the shots. And that all came out in Darrell Issa's hearing. Had that additional money been there, that would have made a nickel's worth of difference in whether or not there was deployable assets, diplomatic security types, and the like, to accompany him there. Not any difference, but it's a great distraction to attack Darrell Issa, who did a great job in that oversight hearing a week ago. I mean, that was an extraordinary hearing. And all of that will come out afterwards. And just for the record, I wrote the Embassy Security Act. After Dar es Salaam got hit in Nairobi, back in the late 90s, I had Admiral Crow, who was then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, went on to become Clinton's ambassador to the UK. He did what they call the Accountability Review Board. He came to the hearing, as did Carpenter, Secretary Carpenter from Diplomatic Security, and they marveled, frankly, at how asleep we were as a State Department in not realizing that after so many other previous attempts at Americans, that Al-Qaeda did not have the ability or the will to manifest itself in places other than what you would think of the usual targets. Because 2 African countries didn't look like they were high on the priorities list. And many people died, some of our embassy, but a lot of locals died in that terrible bombings. So I wrote the Embassy Security Act. It provided $900 million each year for 5 years for setbacks, putting Mylar and other kind of protections in smaller window panes, because shrapnel kills so many people when your embassy or any building gets blown up. And all those things, and there's been frankly, a bipartisan effort, healthy, and it should be, to make sure we have those kinds of protections for the Foreign Service officers who are brave individuals, but again, what they do and the culture starts at the top. If they're just monitoring, because it starts at the top. It starts with the Secretary of State and the President. So I take a backseat to no one on my commitment, because I wrote the first law on it, the major law on it, and we've done it ever since, and it's been, thankfully, bipartisan. But again, as a distraction, they say, oh, these guys look to cut that. Well, how about the major mistake in saying, as he did at the UN and elsewhere, President Obama, it was that video. That video is despicable. Nobody in their right mind would ever defend such terrible garbage. But that's not what caused these people to come together and to attack us. So, thankfully, the media is now at least beginning to ask them tougher questions. For all these years, they haven't done that with this administration. And so, thank you. And I need your help. Curtis needs it. Top of the ticket, our freeholders, Sheriff Bohemus, all of us need it, local level. Mike, you need it, but I think you're in. But everyone needs it. And any questions, I'll take it. If